Sometimes the person who changes your life is the same person who ruins your $3,000 shirt. Rain hammered against the streets of Manhattan as yellow taxi lights blurred across the wet pavement, and people rushed beneath black umbrellas without looking at each other. But Sophie Bennett was running too fast to notice any of it. Her white sneakers splashed through puddles as she clutched a cardboard tray with 2 large coffees in one hand and a stack of sketch papers in the other. No, 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 she whispered under her breath, glancing at the time glowing on her cracked phone screen. 8:53. She was already late. Again. Her boss at the downtown bakery had warned her one more mistake would cost her the job, and Sophie couldn't afford that. Not with overdue rent sitting on the kitchen counter and hospital bills stacked beside her mother's medication. Wind whipped through the avenue as she sprinted toward the crosswalk outside Callaway Global Tower, a 60-story wall of steel and glass that seemed to disappear into the storm clouds above Manhattan. The revolving doors spun endlessly as executives in tailored coats stepped out beneath the building canopy. And right in the center of them stood Ethan Callaway, 6'3", dark charcoal overcoat, sharp jawline, cold blue eyes that made everyone around him straighten their posture. The Billionaire CEO barely glanced at the world as his security team followed behind him, one assistant talking rapidly about investor meetings and stock projections. Ethan looked exhausted, like a man who hadn't slept in days. Then Sophie slipped. Her sneaker hit the slick curb. The cardboard tray flew upward. Time froze. Hot coffee exploded across Ethan's white dress shirt and expensive wool coat. The entire entrance went silent. One of the security guards inhaled sharply. The assistant stopped talking mid-sentence. Coffee dripped slowly from Ethan's sleeve onto the marble floor. Sophie stared in horror. "Oh my God," she breathed. Ethan looked down at the stains spreading across his shirt. Then he lifted his eyes toward her. Cold, sharp, unbelievably familiar. Sophie's stomach dropped. "You," Ethan said flatly. Her mouth opened, closed. "Wait." She pointed at him in disbelief. "You're the elevator guy." 2 mornings earlier, she had accidentally spilled iced coffee on him inside a crowded subway station after someone shoved her from behind. Yesterday, she had crashed into him again while exiting an elevator carrying cappuccinos for a client downtown. And now this. 3 days. 3 coffee disasters. Same man. Sophie felt heat crawl into her face. "I swear I'm not doing this on purpose." Ethan stared at her for a long second while rain roared against the glass behind them. Then, unexpectedly, one corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. More like disbelief fighting amusement. "That's somehow worse," he muttered. Sophie crouched immediately, frantically grabbing napkins from her bag. "I'm so sorry, okay? This coat probably costs more than my apartment." She froze the second the words escaped her mouth. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. His gaze lingered on the worn backpack hanging from her shoulder, the sketch papers now scattered across the wet sidewalk, the cheap coffee stains already dried on the sleeve of her sweater. One page had flipped open near his polished shoes. A charcoal sketch stared back at him. It was him, standing alone beside a window, looking tired, looking human. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Sophie stopped breathing the second Ethan bent down and picked up the sketchbook page from the wet sidewalk. Rain dripped from the edge of his coat sleeve as his eyes studied the charcoal drawing in silence. Around them, Manhattan moved in blurred motion beneath flashing headlights and umbrellas, but neither of them seemed to hear the city anymore. Sophie's pulse hammered in her ears. "Give me that," she said quickly, stepping forward, but Ethan lifted the page slightly out of reach. The drawing was simple but strangely intimate. Ethan standing alone beside the massive office windows of Callaway Global, one hand in his pocket, shoulders tense, city lights reflected across the glass behind him. She had drawn it from memory after seeing him the first day at the subway station. Back then she had only noticed one thing about him. He looked lonely. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "You drew this?" Sophie swallowed hard. "I draw everybody." It was a terrible lie, and both of them knew it instantly. One of Ethan's assistants cleared her throat nervously. "Mr. Callaway, the board meeting starts in 12 minutes. Ethan did not answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on Sophie like he was trying to solve a puzzle that annoyed him more than it should. Finally, he handed the paper back to her. "You should look where you are going," he said coolly. Sophie blinked. "You should stop standing in places where people carry coffee." For the first time, An actual smile almost appeared on Ethan's face before disappearing just as quickly. It happened so fast Sophie wondered if she imagined it. Then he turned and walked toward the waiting black SUV, while security rushed to shield him from the rain. Sophie stood frozen beneath the building canopy, clutching the damp sketchbook against her chest. One of the guards opened the SUV door for Ethan, but before getting inside, he looked back at her one last time. Not angry, curious. That somehow felt more dangerous. 20 minutes later, Sophie burst through the back entrance of Bellamy Bakery, completely soaked. The smell of cinnamon and fresh bread wrapped around her instantly. "You are late again," her manager snapped from behind the counter. Sophie opened her mouth to apologize, but her phone buzzed violently inside her pocket. St. Mary's Hospital. Her stomach dropped. She answered immediately. "Mom." A nurse explained calmly that her mother's blood pressure had dropped during treatment and they needed another payment before approving the next round of medication. Sophie closed her eyes. Rent overdue. Student loans. Hospital bills. She felt like she was drowning $1 at a time. "I will figure it out," she whispered after the call ended. But she had no idea how. That night the rain finally stopped over Manhattan, leaving the streets shining beneath yellow streetlights. High above the city, Ethan Calloway stood alone inside his penthouse office wearing a fresh black shirt while the ruined white one hung over a nearby chair. His board meeting had lasted for exhausting hours. Yet somehow the only thing still stuck in his mind was a nervous girl with coffee-stained sleeves and exhausted eyes. Ethan loosened his tie and reached for the stack of investor reports on his desk, but something slipped from between the pages of his coat. A folded sketch paper. He frowned. Sophie must have accidentally dropped it into his pocket during the chaos outside. Ethan unfolded it slowly. Another drawing stared back at him. This time he was sitting alone in the back seat of his car, looking out the rain-covered window. Underneath the sketch, written in tiny handwriting, were 5 words that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. Some people look cold-hurting. The next morning Manhattan woke beneath pale gray skies and the smell of rain still clinging to the sidewalks, while Sophie Bennett stood in line at a corner coffee shop counting quarters in her palm. $2.17. That was all she had left until Friday. She stared at the menu overhead, debating whether to skip breakfast again when her phone buzzed with another hospital notification. Payment reminder. Sophie closed the screen immediately before the panic in her chest could grow worse. "Medium coffee for Sophie," the barista called out. Sophie grabbed the cup carefully this time, almost afraid the universe was waiting to embarrass her again. She had barely stepped outside when a black SUV rolled slowly past the curb beside her. The tinted back window lowered halfway. Sophie nearly dropped the coffee anyway. Ethan Calloway sat inside wearing a dark navy suit, one hand resting against his jaw, as if he had not slept all night. Their eyes met through the cold morning air. Sophie froze. "Seriously?" she muttered under her breath. Ethan looked at the cup in her hand first, then at her. "Should I be concerned?" Sophie clutched the coffee protectively. "I am holding this one with both hands." For a second he said nothing, but she caught the smallest flicker of amusement in his eyes again. It made him look younger somehow, less untouchable. The traffic light changed. Ethan's driver waited. Yet Ethan still did not look away from her. "You draw strangers often?" he asked finally. Sophie blinked. "Only interesting ones." The answer escaped before she could stop it. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her like she had said something unexpected. Then the window rolled up and the SUV disappeared into morning traffic, leaving Sophie standing there with her heartbeat, doing strange things she did not appreciate. By noon she arrived at the small art department of Bellamy Creative downtown, where she occasionally picked up freelance illustration work between bakery shifts. The office buzzed with stress the second she walked in. "Sophie, thank God." Her supervisor Claire rushed over holding a tablet. "One of our illustrators dropped out, and we need emergency help for a campaign presentation tomorrow." Sophie pushed damp hair behind her ear. "For who?" Claire turned the tablet around. Sophie almost choked. "Callaway Global Charity Winter Campaign." Sophie stared at the giant company logo in disbelief. "No," Claire frowned. "No. I mean yes. Totally yes." 24 hours later, Sophie found herself standing inside Callaway Global Tower again, except this time she was not outside in the rain. She was inside the executive conference room on the 52nd floor, trying not to pass out. Massive glass windows overlooked all of Manhattan, while investors and marketing executives sat around a polished black table discussing numbers that sounded larger than countries. Sophie quietly adjusted her sketch portfolio against her chest and prayed no coffee existed anywhere nearby. Then the conference room doors opened. Ethan walked in without looking up from the documents in his hand. The room instantly straightened. Conversations died. Even the air seemed to sharpen around him. Sophie's stomach dropped. Ethan stopped walking the second he noticed her sitting near the end of the table. Silence stretched. One executive whispered nervously, "You know her?" Sophie wanted the floor to open beneath her. Ethan's eyes moved slowly from her face to the paper coffee cup sitting dangerously close to her elbow, then back to her again. "Unfortunately," he said calmly, "yes." A few people laughed awkwardly. Sophie tried to sink deeper into her chair. But before Ethan sat down, something unexpected happened. He reached over, took the coffee cup from beside her elbow, and moved it safely to the other side of the table. "Let us not make it 4 days in a row," he said quietly. Sophie stared at Ethan across the massive conference table while heat crawled into her cheeks. The executives around them chuckled politely, relieved their intimidating billionaire had apparently made a joke, but Sophie could barely breathe. Ethan Calloway joking was somehow more unsettling than Ethan Calloway glaring at her. He sat down at the head of the table with calm precision, adjusting the silver cuff of his sleeve before opening the presentation documents in front of him. "Let us begin," he said smoothly. Instantly the room snapped into focus. Numbers appeared across giant screens. Marketing projections, charity partnerships, winter fundraising campaigns. Sophie tried to concentrate on her sketch portfolio, but every few seconds she felt Ethan's gaze drift toward her from the other end of the table. Not constantly, just enough to make her aware of him at all times. It was exhausting. 2 hours later the meeting finally ended. Executives gathered their tablets and rushed toward elevators while Sophie remained seated, reorganizing her scattered sketches with trembling fingers. She was so distracted she did not notice Ethan still standing near the window behind her until his voice broke the silence. "You always draw people like that?" Sophie nearly jumped out of her chair. "You seriously need to stop appearing behind me like a ghost." Ethan ignored the comment. "The sketches." He nodded toward her folder. "You draw strangers emotionally." Sophie hesitated. Outside the towering windows, Manhattan glowed silver beneath low winter clouds. "I draw what people try to hide," she admitted quietly. Ethan studied her for a long moment. "And what do you think I am hiding?" Sophie laughed nervously. "Probably several lawsuits and childhood trauma." To her horror, Ethan actually laughed. Low, brief, real. Sophie blinked in shock because suddenly he did not look like the ruthless billionaire from magazine covers anymore. He looked human, tired, almost lonely again. Ethan noticed her staring, and the wall returned instantly. "Your campaign sketches are good," he said calmly. "Claire made the right decision hiring you." Sophie hugged the portfolio tighter. "Thank you." Her phone buzzed suddenly in her coat pocket. Hospital again. Sophie's smile faded immediately as she glanced at the screen. Ethan noticed the change in her expression. "Everything all right?" Sophie locked the phone quickly. "Yeah, fine." Another lie that sounded terrible out loud. Ethan did not press further, but his eyes lingered on her for half a second longer than necessary. Later that evening, Sophie remained alone in the design department finishing revisions while most of the tower emptied for the night. The building became strangely quiet after dark. Only the distant hum of elevators and soft tapping keyboards echoed through the massive floors. Sophie rubbed her tired eyes and glanced at the clock. 10:47 p.m. She still had another bakery shift starting at 6 in the morning. Her stomach growled painfully. She had not eaten since noon. "You are still here?" Sophie turned sharply. Ethan stood in the doorway holding a black coffee in one hand. Suit jacket loosened slightly now, like even billionaires eventually became exhausted. Sophie looked around awkwardly. "You own the building. Sneaking up on people in your own building feels unfair." Ethan walked closer, setting a small paper bag beside her sketches. The cafeteria was closing. Sophie stared at the bag cautiously before opening it. A warm grilled cheese sandwich, tomato soup, chocolate chip cookies. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. "You bought me dinner?" Ethan shrugged lightly. "Technically, the company paid for it." Sophie smiled despite herself. "Thank you." Ethan leaned one shoulder against the nearby desk, sipping his black coffee while city lights shimmered through the windows behind him. You work 3 jobs? Sophie looked up in surprise. How do you know that? You answered emails at 3 different times from 3 different uniforms. Sophie laughed softly. That is either impressive or terrifying. Probably both. Silence settled comfortably between them for the first time. Then, Sophie noticed something strange. Ethan had barely touched his coffee. He simply held it like a habit. Like armor. You hate coffee, do not you? She asked suddenly. Ethan looked at the cup in mild surprise. What makes you think that? Sophie nodded toward it. You never drink it. You just hold it. Ethan glanced down at the untouched black coffee in his hand. For the first time in years, he realized she was right. Sophie stared at Ethan across the dim design office while steam curled from the untouched black coffee in his hand. The city lights behind him painted silver reflections across the windows, making Manhattan feel impossibly far away from the quiet moment between them. Ethan glanced down at the cup again after her comment, almost like he had never considered it before. I used to drink it constantly, he admitted finally. Now? Sophie asked softly. Ethan gave a faint shrug. Now it just keeps me company. Something about the answer made Sophie's chest ache unexpectedly. Billionaires were supposed to have everything. Yet Ethan always sounded like a man sitting alone in a giant empty room. Sophie looked down at her sandwich to avoid staring too long. That might be the saddest thing I have ever heard. Another almost smile touched his mouth before fading away. Ethan set the coffee aside untouched once again. And you? He asked. What keeps you company? Sophie laughed quietly. Overdue bills. Anxiety. Instant noodles. Ethan's eyes drifted toward the stack of sketches spread across her desk. Not the drawings? Sophie hesitated. Then she carefully opened the worn sketchbook lying beside her elbow. The edges were bent and softened from years of use. The drawings helped me breathe, she admitted. Ethan stepped closer slowly, like he did not want to interrupt something fragile. Sophie flipped through pages filled with charcoal sketches of strangers she had seen across New York. A tired subway musician. A woman crying quietly in a taxi. A construction worker asleep during lunch break. Ethan studied every page in silence. You always notice sad people, he said quietly. Sophie shrugged. Sad people are easier to recognize. The room fell still after that sentence. Too still. Sophie instantly regretted saying it out loud. But Ethan did not laugh or change the subject. His expression softened in a way she had never seen before. Then suddenly the lights flickered. Once. Twice. And the entire floor went dark. Sophie gasped softly as the city outside vanished into black glass reflections. Somewhere deep inside the tower, emergency systems hummed to life. A few dim backup lights blinked on near the hallway ceiling. Please tell me billionaires pay their electric bill, Sophie muttered nervously. Ethan actually laughed this time. A real laugh. Warm and brief and startlingly attractive. Backup generators will start in a minute. But they did not. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The design floor remained trapped in low emergency lighting while winter rain started tapping softly against the windows again. Sophie wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. Okay, this officially feels like the beginning of a horror movie. Ethan leaned against the nearby desk with his sleeves rolled slightly now, looking oddly relaxed for the first time since she met him. You get scared easily? I spilled coffee on the same billionaire 3 days in a row. Clearly fear no longer controls my life. Ethan shook his head slowly, amusement lingering in his eyes. Then silence settled again, softer this time. Comfortable. Sophie absent-mindedly began sketching beneath the emergency lights while waiting for power to return. Ethan watched quietly from across the desk. Can I ask you something? She said after a moment. Depends. Sophie glanced up carefully. Why do you always look like you are waiting for something bad to happen? Ethan's expression changed instantly. The warmth vanished so fast it startled her. Sophie immediately lowered the pencil. Sorry. Ignore me. That was too personal. But Ethan kept staring out at the dark skyline for several seconds before answering. Because every time I trusted someone, he said quietly, they wanted something from me. Sophie looked at him in silence. For the first time since meeting Ethan Calloway, she finally understood something important. He was not cold because he lacked feelings. He was cold because he had spent years trying to survive them. Then without thinking, Sophie tore a small page from her sketchbook and slid it across the desk toward him. Ethan picked it up slowly. It was a tiny sketch of a coffee cup beside one handwritten sentence. Not everyone who approaches you wants to take something. Ethan stared at the words for a very long time. The backup generators finally kicked in nearly 20 minutes later, flooding the design floor with soft white light again. But something between Sophie and Ethan had already changed in the darkness. Neither of them mentioned it. Ethan still held the small sketch page in his hand long after the lights returned, his thumb brushing unconsciously across the handwritten sentence near the coffee cup drawing. Sophie pretended not to notice. She packed her pencils slowly into her worn canvas bag while trying to ignore the strange, nervous warmth sitting in her chest. "You should go home," Ethan said quietly after a while. Sophie laughed softly. "That sounds nice in theory." Ethan looked at her carefully. "What does that mean?" Sophie immediately regretted the comment. Nothing. But Ethan had spent years reading boardrooms full of liars and nervous investors. He recognized deflection instantly. "Sophie." His voice softened slightly. "What is wrong?" The concern in his tone caught her off guard more than the question itself. Sophie stared down at her sketchbook for several seconds before answering. "My mother has kidney failure," she admitted quietly. "Most of my money goes to hospital bills." Ethan's expression changed instantly. Not pity. Something heavier. Sophie forced a small smile. "So if I seem stressed all the time, that is probably why." Silence settled between them again, but this silence felt different. Fragile. Honest. Ethan slowly set the untouched coffee aside and loosened his tie further, exhaustion finally visible across his face now that nobody else was around to witness it. "When my father died," he said quietly, "I spent 3 years pretending I was fine because everyone expected me to keep the company alive." Sophie looked up in surprise. Ethan rarely spoke about himself. "Were you?" she asked. Softly. Ethan gave a humorless smile. "Not even close." Sophie watched him carefully beneath the office lights. Suddenly, the polished billionaire image cracked just enough for her to glimpse the man underneath. The lonely man from her sketches. Before either of them could say another word, the elevator doors slid open behind them. Sharp heels clicked across the marble floor. Sophie turned instinctively and felt her stomach tighten. The woman stepping out looked like she belonged on magazine covers. Tall, elegant, dark red coat fitted perfectly against her figure. Diamond earrings glimmering beneath sleek blonde hair. She carried herself with effortless confidence. Ethan's entire posture changed the second he saw her. His expression hardened instantly. "Victoria," he said flatly. The woman smiled slowly. "Still working yourself to death, I see." Sophie looked between them awkwardly, suddenly very aware she was standing inside something personal. Victoria's sharp gaze landed on Sophie next. It traveled over Sophie's thrift store cardigan, messy ponytail, and charcoal-smudged fingers before settling on the sketchbook in her arms. "And who is this?" she asked lightly. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "A designer working on the campaign." Victoria raised one elegant eyebrow. "The coffee girl?" Sophie froze. Ethan looked genuinely irritated now. "Do not start." Victoria laughed softly, but there was something cold underneath it. "Relax. The internet already started for me." She pulled out her phone and turned the screen toward him. Sophie's blood ran cold instantly. A blurry photo filled the screen. Her spilling coffee across Ethan outside Callaway Global 3 days ago. Headlines underneath screamed across celebrity blogs. "Mystery girl caught with billionaire Ethan Callaway." Secret romance or publicity stunt? Sophie's face burned with humiliation. "Oh my God." Victoria studied her reaction with quiet amusement. "You should be careful. People in his world destroy each other for entertainment." Ethan stepped forward immediately. "That is enough." But Sophie barely heard him anymore. Her stomach twisted as she stared at the article comments scrolling beneath the photo. Gold digger. Clumsy fangirl. Attention seeker. She suddenly felt painfully small standing inside Ethan's polished world of glass towers and luxury headlines. Victoria slipped her phone back into her purse calmly. "I am only warning her." Then she looked directly at Sophie and smiled politely. People close to Ethan usually get hurt eventually. Sophie barely remembered leaving Callaway Global that night. Victoria's words followed her all the way downtown through crowded sidewalks and freezing wind. People close to Ethan usually get hurt eventually. The sentence repeated in her head while she sat alone on the subway clutching her sketchbook against her chest. Across the dark train window, her reflection looked exhausted. Small. out of place in a world filled with billionaires and headlines. By the time she reached her apartment building after midnight, snow had started falling softly across Manhattan. Sophie climbed the narrow stairs to the tiny fourth-floor apartment she shared with her mother and quietly pushed the door open. The smell of soup greeted her immediately. "Soph?" her mother called weakly from the couch. Sophie forced a smile the second she saw her. "You should be asleep." Her mother looked pale beneath the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, but she still smiled warmly. "You say that every night." Sophie knelt beside the couch and adjusted the blanket gently. "How are you feeling?" "Better now that you are home." The answer nearly broke her heart. Sophie looked around the tiny apartment. Cracked paint near the ceiling. Old radiator humming loudly. Medical bills stacked beside grocery coupons on the kitchen counter. Then she remembered Ethan standing inside a penthouse office larger than this entire building, looking just as lonely as she felt. It made no sense. The next morning, the internet situation got worse. Sophie arrived at Bellamy Bakery before sunrise, only to find two teenage customers whispering while staring at their phones. One of them glanced up at Sophie and gasped quietly. "That is her." Sophie's stomach dropped instantly. She hurried behind the counter, pretending not to notice, but by lunch break the article had spread. Everywhere. Coffee girl linked to billionaire CEO. Random strangers online analyzed her clothes, her face, even the old sneakers she wore in the photo outside Callaway Global. Sophie locked herself inside the employee restroom during break and tried not to cry. Her phone buzzed again. "Ethan." She stared at the screen for several seconds before answering quietly. "Hi. Where are you?" His voice sounded tense. Sophie leaned against the sink. "Work. Have you seen the articles?" Sophie laughed softly without humor. Kind of hard to avoid them. Silence filled the line for a moment. Then Ethan spoke more quietly. "I am handling it." Sophie closed her eyes. "That is the problem, Ethan." It was the first time she had ever called him by his first name. The silence after it felt strangely intimate. "I do not need to be handled," she whispered. Ethan exhaled slowly on the other end of the call. "Victoria should not have spoken to you like that." Sophie looked down at the flour dust covering her apron. She was not completely wrong. "Do not." His voice sharpened instantly. "Do not start believing strangers who profit from humiliating people online." Sophie swallowed hard. Part of her wanted to believe him. Another part remembered she had no place beside someone like Ethan Callaway. Before she could answer, her manager suddenly burst through the hallway doors looking panicked. "Sophie, there are reporters outside." Her blood turned cold instantly. "What?" "They keep asking if you are dating Ethan Callaway." Sophie's hands started shaking. Ethan heard everything through the phone. "Stay inside," he said immediately. "I am coming there now." But Sophie was already panicking. This was exactly what she feared. Her life becoming entertainment for strangers. Her sick mother dragged into gossip headlines because she accidentally crossed paths with the wrong billionaire 3 times. "Do not come," she whispered quickly. "Sophie, please." Her voice cracked softly. "You being near me only makes this worse." Silence answered her. Heavy silence. Then finally Ethan spoke again, but his voice sounded quieter now. "Hurt somehow." "You really believe that?" Sophie closed her eyes tightly. The worst part was she did not know anymore. Outside the bakery windows, camera flashes suddenly exploded across the snowy sidewalk. Sophie avoided Ethan for the next 4 days. She ignored his calls, stopped replying to company emails after midnight, and left the design department before he arrived every morning. It should have made things easier. Instead, everything felt strangely empty. The bakery still smelled like cinnamon every sunrise. The subway still screeched beneath Manhattan. Her sketchbook still filled with charcoal drawings late at night beside hospital bills and untouched cups of instant noodles. But now every quiet moment reminded her of Ethan holding black coffee he never drank and looking at her like she saw something nobody else did. On Friday evening, Sophie finally arrived at Callaway Global again for the winter charity gala rehearsal. She almost turned around the second she stepped into the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, while women in designer gowns moved between waiters carrying silver trays of champagne. Everything shimmered with wealth she could barely imagine. Sophie looked down at her simple navy dress and instantly regretted coming. "You came." Her breath caught immediately. Ethan stood near the ballroom entrance wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that somehow made the entire room seem less polished beside him. For a second, neither of them moved. Sophie noticed the exhaustion beneath his eyes instantly. He noticed she looked thinner, like neither of them had slept properly all week. Claire said attendance was mandatory, Sophie answered quietly. Ethan nodded once. You stopped answering my calls. Sophie forced a small smile. You are very observant for a billionaire. But Ethan did not smile back this time. Sophie. His voice lowered slightly. I miss talking to you. The honesty in the sentence hit her so hard, she looked away immediately. Before she could answer, camera flashes exploded near the ballroom entrance. Reporters, investors, socialites. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Sophie stepped back on instinct. Ethan noticed. You do not need to be afraid of them. Sophie laughed softly without humor. Easy for you to say. They do not know your shoe size and credit score by tomorrow morning. Ethan's expression darkened because he knew she was right. Suddenly, Victoria appeared beside the main staircase wearing a silver designer gown that sparkled beneath the ballroom lights. She moved gracefully through the crowd until she reached Ethan's side, placing one manicured hand lightly against his arm like she belonged there. Sophie's chest tightened unexpectedly. Victoria smiled politely at her. Still around, Ethan immediately stepped away from Victoria's touch. Enough. But Victoria only looked amused. Relax. The board members already think your little coffee romance is adorable. Sophie's face burned instantly. Nearby investors began whispering quietly while glancing in their direction. Ethan's jaw clenched. Victoria. What? She replied lightly. You spent years building an image of control. Now suddenly every tabloid in New York thinks you are dating a struggling artist who throws cappuccinos at you. Sophie swallowed hard. There it was again. The reminder that she did not belong in this world. Victoria leaned slightly closer to Ethan, lowering her voice just enough for Sophie to still hear it. You cannot seriously risk a merger over a girl who shops at thrift stores. Ethan went completely still. The ballroom noise seemed to disappear around them. Slowly, Ethan turned toward Victoria with an expression Sophie had never seen before. Calm, cold, final. Do not speak about her like that again. Victoria blinked in surprise. Ethan rarely defended anyone publicly. But before Sophie could even process what happened next, one of the giant presentation screens at the front of the ballroom suddenly flickered on by accident. The room quieted immediately. Sophie froze in horror the second her own sketches filled the massive screen. Her private drawings of Ethan. Ethan sitting alone in his office. Ethan staring out rainy windows. Ethan holding untouched coffee. Hundreds of guests turned toward the images, whispering in confusion. Sophie's blood ran cold. No, she whispered. Someone had uploaded her sketchbook files onto the ballroom presentation system. The ballroom fell completely silent as Sophie's sketches stretched across the giant presentation screens above hundreds of wealthy guests. Every private drawing she had hidden inside her sketchbook now glowed beneath crystal chandeliers for the entire room to see. Ethan standing alone in his office at midnight. Ethan staring out rain-covered windows. Ethan holding untouched coffee cups like they were shields against loneliness. Sophie felt panic rise so fast she could barely breathe. Turn it off, she whispered. But nobody moved immediately because the room had become hypnotized by the drawings. The billionaire everyone described as cold suddenly looked heartbreakingly human through Sophie's eyes. One sketch appeared larger than the others. Ethan seated alone inside the back of his black SUV beneath blurred city lights. Underneath it, her handwritten words glowed across the massive screen. Some people look cold because nobody ever stayed long enough to warm them. Murmurs spread through the ballroom instantly. Sophie's face burned with humiliation. She knew exactly who had done this. Victoria stood near the staircase watching calmly, though the slight tension in her jaw betrayed her satisfaction. Sophie clutched her sketchbook tightly against her chest and turned toward the exit. Sophie. Ethan reached for her wrist gently before she could disappear into the crowd. She looked up at him with panic in her eyes. Please let me go. But Ethan did not release her immediately. Around them, reporters had already begun lifting phones. Camera flashes burst across the ballroom. Investors whispered nervously. Sophie wanted the floor to swallow her whole. You should not have to hide, Ethan said quietly. Sophie laughed shakily. Easy for you to say. Your worst day still ends in a penthouse. The words hit harder than she intended. Ethan's expression shifted instantly. Hurt flickered across his face before he masked it again. Sophie pulled her hand free gently and stepped backward. This was a mistake. Then she turned and walked quickly toward the ballroom exit, while whispers followed her across polished marble floors. Ethan stood frozen for one long second watching her disappear. Then something inside him finally broke. He looked up at the giant screens still glowing with Sophie's sketches and suddenly understood the terrifying truth he had spent weeks avoiding. Nobody had looked at him this honestly in years. Nobody had seen through the billionaire image to the lonely, exhausted man underneath. And he was about to lose the one person who did. "Stop the music," Ethan said suddenly. The ballroom froze again. His voice carried effortlessly across the room. The orchestra stopped playing immediately. Every eye turned toward him. Even Sophie stopped near the entrance. Ethan walked slowly toward the center stage beneath the enormous screens still filled with her artwork. His expression remained calm, but his heartbeat felt violent inside his chest. "Most people in this room know me as a businessman," he said evenly. "A man who built companies, closed deals, controlled outcomes." Silence wrapped around the ballroom. Ethan looked directly towards Sophie, standing near the doors. "What none of you know is that for years I stopped feeling anything that could not be measured in contracts or numbers." Sophie stared at him motionlessly. Ethan glanced up at her sketches above him and smiled faintly for the first time all night. "Then a girl spilled coffee on me 3 days in a row." Soft laughter rippled through the room. Ethan's eyes never left Sophie, and somehow she saw me more clearly than anyone else ever has. Sophie felt tears burn behind her eyes instantly. Ethan reached toward a waiter passing nearby and calmly took a fresh cup of coffee from the silver tray. The entire ballroom watched in confusion as he looked directly at Sophie one more time, then deliberately poured the coffee straight down the front of his own white dress shirt. Gasps exploded through the crowd. Sophie stared at him in shock. Ethan looked down at the spreading stain before laughing quietly to himself. "There," he said softly. "Now we are even." For one suspended second, the ballroom stayed silent. Then Sophie laughed through her tears for the very first time all night. And the moment Ethan saw her smile again, he realized something terrifyingly simple. He would rather be ruined beside her than untouched without her.